My name is Eric Alexander. I'm the Executive Director of the Brigham Education Institute. It's great to have you all join us, invite you all here. So today's session is going to be about moving up the ladder and promotion and how Harvard Medical School thinks about promotion on the clinician-educator track. And almost all of you are here because you value the inclusion of being at an academic medical center. And so that means so many things. But one of them also is moving up on that academic ladder. And as we've done every few years, we invite Carol back. Carol's the Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs at Harvard Medical School, a good friend and colleague, and also just so helpful in kind of reading between the lines and thinking between the weeds on how you do this as a young or mid-level clinician educator or healthcare educator. With that, I just want to thank you, Carol, for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to you. As we discussed earlier, sometimes the question and answer here is equally as good as your slides. So I invite everyone to go ahead and make sure you are keeping track of your questions or put them in the chat box, which will be monitored by Christina DeZara. Wave, Christina. And also, last thing I forgot to mention, we do record these sessions for others. If you don't want to be recorded for your video or audio, just obviously turn that off. But otherwise, happy to catch you and hope that you'll participate. With that, I'll turn it over, Carol, to you.
Thank you so much, Eric, and hello, and nice to see a number of familiar faces in the participant window. Thanks to Christina for managing the chat, which I find hard to do while presenting. In addition to my role in the Office for Faculty Affairs, I just point out that I am a clinician educator myself. I was residency program director in primary care at BEI for almost 20 years, and so I understand this from a personal perspective as well as from our office's perspective. So my goals are to look at the promotions process for people who self-identify as clinicians or educators in the Faculty of Medicine. We'll focus on our office's lens and the promotions process lens of the areas of excellence. And in order to explain that, I'm going to just touch on a couple of contributions and achievements in the Harvard CV that are particular, that are perhaps not well known and well understood as tips. Our office does do a lot of sessions on that are often rank specific or sessions on the Harvard CV. I'm not going to go into great detail on the minutiae of the Harvard CV today, although if there are questions about that, I'm happy to entertain them at the end. We have professors who are mentoring others, and it looks like most of you are looking at the rank transition from assistant to associate, but with a fair number whose next step would be associate to full, and several instructors. And let's share the next poll. And so how do you primarily identify as an educator, as a clinician, as an investigator? And too hard to choose might be you're really not sure. So there are a few of you who have chosen the too hard to choose, and we have more people who've chosen educator over clinician. So I'm going to open with the fact that there are two pathways to promotion if you are currently at the rank of instructor and going to assistant professor. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the construct of area of excellence, as I've already alluded to, but we will touch on longer service. And longer service is a pathway that is open only to people who are clinician educators. It's not a pathway for investigators, and we'll talk about that. I do want to point out that the pathway to the left, the area of excellence pathway, goes all the way up the ladder. Longer service ends at assistant professor, although we do have people who have been promoted to associate professor after longer service promotion, but you have to meet all the metrics to the area of excellence construct. So HMS in the up the academic rank, every faculty member has to choose one area of excellence. And for the 3 or more of you who said it's too hard to choose, you are not alone, it happens. Sometimes it literally does feel like a coin flip to choose between the 3. But for most people, I think it's relatively straightforward. And at the end of the day, if you're one of those coin flip people, there's a pathway ahead, so don't worry about it. And we'll talk about that. So I'm not talking today about investigation, although I'm happy to entertain questions. We don't have slides on that. We're going to focus on clinical expertise and innovation in teaching and educational leadership, because that is the most common pathway for people who self-identify as clinician educators. I'll touch briefly, and really only briefly, because I don't think anybody, very many people on this session are not meeting their teaching requirements. That's an uncommon problem for people in this. And I am going to talk about significant supporting activities, because that is really the mechanism to address the problem when you're bridging both CEI and TEL, as we refer to them, and are having a struggle to do that. Most people who use significant supporting activities are not struggling to determine what their area of excellence is, but that is the solution for that, and we'll talk about that. So here are the typical phenotypes that we think about, emphasizing again that it has to be one area of excellence. So clinical expertise and innovation, it's very intentionally named expertise and innovation. So you have some expertise in a clinical field that would have impact on patient care, and the vast majority of people are actually physically seeing patients. And then you're innovating in some fashion. And the ways in which you could be affecting care delivery are, this is a partial list. It's not, you may be innovating in a space that's outside of that, but it's really focused on the care delivery. And we'll talk about the CV section on clinical innovations towards the end. I'm going to skip investigation, except to say that there are people who are primarily in medical education who are funded. Eric is going to talk. You heard about funding in medical education, hard to come by. There are people who are educators who've run NIH R01 trials. They're unusual. So it's not impossible to come forward in an investigation if you self-identify as a clinician educator, but it's unusual. And then in teaching and educational leadership, we have people who are viewing themselves as primarily focused on medical education. There does need to be scholarship, and that's going to be the crux of the matter, oftentimes, in choosing between these. And then the CV section, analogous to the clinical innovation section, is teaching innovations for candidates in teaching and educational leadership. So how do you think about this for those of you where it's tricky? So it should be what you're mostly working on, where your achievements and impact have been. It should be represented both by quantity and quality of the contributions, and contributions thought of broadly, but often coming down in particular to the fifth point on this list, which is scholarship. It's what you're known for and recognized for. There are people who have pivots in their careers and switch careers, and that can be tricky. And particularly if you made a switch some time ago, like many years ago, it should really represent what you're doing currently. It does have to be represented in your scholarship, and that is really often the crux, as I've implied before. And then there's the question of the shared understanding. And this can be tricky, and I'll get to that in a minute, but it really should be what you identify and what your department chair and mentor identify as your primary domain of activity. So this data is 2018 to 2019. It really doesn't change very much from year to year, and we've been tracking this now for more than a decade. So you'll see that investigation in CI, in this particular year, we had more people who came forward in clinical expertise and innovation than investigation. That division moves a little bit from year to year, but it's roughly somewhere around 45 to 50% of the entire faculty. And this is just looking at assistant and associate, but it's not really very different at the professorial level. And then there's this really small red slice of the pie in teaching and educational leadership, and that is often the crux of many of the questions that come in a session like this. And I'm just going to say that the school convened task force is looking at this. I think the upshot of that was that there was value in maintaining these two different approaches and not merging CEI and TEL. But I would say that the primary reason that we have a number of people who are educators but are promoted in CEI relates to where their scholarship lays, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so this concept of significant supporting activities, so you choose an area of excellence, most of you will be CEI or TEL, and then the question is, do you also include significant supporting activities? And if you're somebody who really, either can't decide or, could make a strong argument for either, then the answer is clearly the alternate one that isn't your area of excellence should be a significant supporting activity. So we have currently 5. I will tell you that we're expecting to add a 6th significant supporting activity, hopefully before the end of this year, that focuses on work and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Was presented to Faculty Council last week, and we're hoping to have that move forward soon. But this is the current roster. So if you are coming forward in teaching educational leadership, but you're a clinician and a clinical expert, then you would have clinical expertise as your significant supporting activity. Conversely, if you're coming forward and teaching in clinical expertise and innovation, and medical education is an enormous part of your identity, chances are you're going to have special merit in education. You wouldn't have CEI and then a significant supporting activity in clinical expertise, right? They have to be different than your primary area of excellence. Many people, probably one of the most common significant supporting activities that we see is administration and institutional service, where you have important administrative roles. Probably the least common that we see is education of patients and service to the community. It is very important, but it's just not something that we see very frequently. And these are intended to recognize your important contributions outside your primary area of excellence, and also to recognize that some of these things are very time consuming, especially administration and institutional service and clinical expertise, and may take away from your time to write. And so these play out in part in thinking about the body of scholarship, and there's no specific number of papers that any one significant supporting activity counts for, but it plays out, and when candidates are discussed, to say, I feel like this is a direct quote, this candidate has a smaller body of scholarship than many people that we see at this rank and in this area of excellence, but they have very strong significant supporting activities, and therefore on balance I support the promotion. It's not a numerical calculation, but that's how it works. And it doesn't mean that you should only include these if you and your mentor and chair think that your scholarship might be questioned. We'd like to see people include the significant supporting activities that really make sense, whether or not they're quote unquote needed. So these are not required. We see a lot of candidates who have no significant supporting activities. So if none of these seem relevant, don't worry about that. As mentioned, they're outside your area of excellence. You should be spending a significant amount of time on them. If your dossier comes forward with a significant supporting activity and people don't think it's merited, that can be more harmful than the converse of not having one when it should be there. And ultimately, it's, every piece of this has to be agreed upon by the department that's putting you forward. Teaching, just a couple of things that I want to highlight. As you probably know, or hopefully do know, HMS does require that every faculty member provide at least 50 hours a year of teaching of Harvard learners, from students to peers and everything in between. Includes a whole host of teaching activities, clinical and research supervision count. It doesn't count prep time, no matter how much time you put in preparation, and we know that can be a lot. You can count mentorship even if you're not an official named mentor. I would say the most important point here is that teaching outside of Harvard does not count towards the requirements. So if you happen to be teaching, if you happen to have Tufts learners that are working with you, or BU learners, it should be on your CV, but that's not going to count towards the 50 hours. Okay, so I'm going to dive in to the differences between clinical expertise and innovation in teaching and educational leadership. So, and let me say that this slide and many of these slides are written broadly and not rank specific. So as a general rule, the higher you are in the academic ladder, the greater the level of accomplishment that is expected. So you, as I said, should be recognized as a clinical expert, and that could be manifested by what you're giving talks about, what you're teaching about. If you're teaching the residents and you're teaching peers about a particular topic, if as you go up the ranks, if you're teaching it national and internationally, that's evidence of your clinical expertise, as is scholarship in that domain. And again, you have to be doing innovations at the local level. Those at the assistant professor level, they're going to be more likely than not local innovations. The higher you go in rank, the greater the expectations around dissemination of those innovations. As alluded to earlier, much of the work that we do is not well funded, so we're not expecting to see a record of funding here. And the scholarship is the most important thing. So, you know, there is, I think, has been a perception in the community that we, rightly so, that we have an enormous number of critical educators, and we have a tiny number of people in comparison who are promoted in teaching educational leadership. And most often that comes down to what your scholarship is in. So if you are leading a fellowship program and you're the fellowship director, but you're writing about the clinical aspects of your specialty, your scholarship is in clinical expertise and innovation, and that is going to push you towards CEI rather than TEL, even though you're devoting an enormous amount of effort and your heart is really invested in the success of your educational program. I mentioned the clinical innovations is a key part of this. And the higher you go in rank, the greater the expectations, again, that this would be disseminated. And that's just can be disseminated in written publications, which you know is great, but there are other ways to describe dissemination when you're listing clinical innovations. And that could be, in this example, somebody presented this at a meeting and disseminated it locally to Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. And so what we're looking for is usually an unofficial name of the innovation, the timing of when it was, a brief concept of what you did that changed care delivery, and how, if there's anything to say about dissemination, how you did that. Okay, teaching and educational leadership. Most often people in this area of excellence have educational leadership roles, and the level of that role might vary. You might be a co-director as an assistant professor. I will say that most people who come forward as associate and full professor in this area of excellence have been a clerkship director, a residency, a program director, a fellowship program director, et cetera. That's not an absolute must, but that is a most. Scholarship in all these domains most often does include original peer-reviewed publications. We probably see fewer research investigations in people in teaching educational leadership than in the other ranks, although at the professorial rank, there would be an expectation that you've done some research in medical education. It would be very unusual for an investigator to put forward in their selected scholarship for the promotion purposes a disseminated curriculum, but we do see that on occasion in TEL candidates, and you could, you know, an assessment tool that you developed that had been disseminated, certainly something that was in MedEd portal could be some of your highlighted scholarship. Many people have teaching awards. It's not required, and again, funding is generally not seen. And actually, my earlier statement about I misspoke earlier. I was thinking, and when I spoke here, funding is less important for CEI. We do actually see a fair number of people in CEI who have funding. We see much less funding in candidates in teaching and educational leadership. And again, the innovation section would include the description of what you developed, or a title, some content, a couple of sentences about what you did that was different, and then if you have the information, how it was disseminated. This slide lists the report of teaching in the order in which these things appear on the CV, just as a reminder that all these things count towards teaching. And I want to we're going to call out a little bit this section on mentorship, which this line of laboratory and other research supervisory and training responsibilities is really time and mentorship, although it's not named in such a way that it obviously suits a clinician educator. And this mentored list of mentees is also important, with, again, an expectation that the higher you are in rank, the greater the impact you demonstrate on the list of mentees. So who might you list as mentees? Those of us who've served as a residency director have touched many people, particularly if you're in internal medicine. And if you're, an internal medicine program director with 50 people are matching a year, we are not looking for you to list every person who's been in your training program. We're really looking for you to identify selected trainees where you've had a particular impact. If they're people that you've mentored in research, you should mention whether they had an abstract, a grant, a publication. In medical education, it could be that you mentored them on teaching sessions that were disseminated to learners. They gave a workshop at a national meeting. They developed a curriculum, and all those are fair game. And in clinical, mentees could be that you mentored them in a QI project, et cetera. We have this statement to say, if asked, individuals that you list would be expected to endorse that you have been their mentor. That is just a mindset that we suggest. We never reach out to mentees to say, did this person really mentor you or not? A couple of comments on scholarship specific to teaching and educational leadership and clinical expertise and innovation. So it is important that you separate out your scholarship. We do, the committees do focus in particular on peer-reviewed publications as an important group. That's not to say it's impossible to be promoted in the absence of peer-reviewed research, particularly at the assistant professor level. But it is helpful to have some research, and again, you're going to hear more sessions that Eric is going to be presenting down the road. We do count MedEd portal, absolutely counts as peer-reviewed and carries a lot of favor. Reviews will count, be viewed more favorably for CEI and TEL candidates than for investigators. And there's the relatively rare category of research publications without named authorship. But I do want to call out, there's the non-peer-reviewed section where reviews and chapters are here, and reviews and chapters can be either in peer-reviewed or in non-peer-reviewed, and we ask you to think carefully about the mechanism by which they were peer-reviewed. And then there's the professional educational materials. So this is where you would put curricula, teaching cases, videos that were used in flipped classrooms, websites that are being used around educational material, and there are clear nationally recognized ways in which we cite research publications. It's obviously grayer for something that's published on the web, and we have guidance in our CV guidance that describes how you might do that. We do encourage you to note in your scholarship when a publication has been done in a mentor. In particular, if you offered first authorship to a mentee, it's helpful to highlight that that was the case, and it doesn't have to be done exactly like this, but this is how we suggest that you do it, so that you denote that the first author, and it is usually first author, second author, first author mentee, second author you, where you had that role, and if there was an editorial or some other citation, or it was called out in some fashion nationally, you can note citations of your scholarship. We have a lot of resources on the Faculty Affairs website. This is, a quick introduction, but you can go to our website and find the criteria that are specific to a rank in an area of excellence. And this, can be a really helpful resource. And you can say, if you're really struggling, how many metrics do I meet in this area of excellence versus the other area of excellence? We also have the information for significant supporting activities. And then we have the longer service criteria, and I'm just going to touch on that before we close and open to questions. So To be promoted under longer service, you have to be engaged in the clinical enterprise and have been on the faculty for at least 10 years. The language says evidence of substantial contribution and growth as a clinician teacher. And the domains that people look at in particular are around your contributions in medical education and your contributions to clinical care delivery. Many people have major contributions to citizenship and leadership, and those are absolutely considered. What's different about longer service is, as I mentioned, it's only to assistant professor. Many people do come to longer service with some written scholarship, but there are candidates who come forward with no written scholarship. And I'm not focusing here on the letters that are required per se, but I will just say that you're coming to PNR, you need 4 letters of evaluation in your dossier. At least one has to be from someone outside of Harvard, and they all have to be written by people at the rank of associate professor or professor themselves. In the longer service pathway, only 3 letters. They can all be internal, and they can be written by people who are themselves assistant professors. The kinds of things that are talking about are the commitment to clinical service and teaching. Many of these things are really important for promotion under PNR, but they are generally not, they may be present in a longer service candidate, but they're in no way required. So some questions about this. One is, what happens if you left Harvard for a while and then came back? If you had a long gap, that's not going to be possible. If you were away for a few years and then returned, you will need to have been back for at least a few years, but it may be possible. You don't necessarily have to start from scratch. And if this is relevant for anybody, we encourage you to reach out to our office before, or to have your department reach out before you launch into that process. People do look at your contributions before you came to HMS, but the focus is going to be on contributions in your decade here. As mentioned, we have at least one person who was promoted to assistant professor under longer service and then is now a full professor. It is relatively uncommon, and you do have to meet the metrics. I don't think anybody has, I'm sure that most people have either come forward in either clinical expertise and innovation or teaching and educational leadership, and then all teaching counts, although it would be, we don't see people whose teaching is limited to research mentorship because they're really not appropriate for the longer service pathway. We have I showed you the promotion profile library where you can link to the specific rank and area of excellence. We have lots of other resources, particularly the handbook. We do meet occasionally one-on-one. Well, we meet more than occasionally. We can't meet with every faculty member who's coming forward to promotion. My team promotes more than 500 people a year. We can't meet with all 500 or we would never actually do the work of promoting anybody. But if you're in a particularly thorny situation, we do have the option to meet with people, and you can also reach out to us for CV questions. And we have a lot of resources on the Harvard CV. Again, we do give talks about the Harvard CV, and those are well attended and I hope very helpful.
Carol, thank you so much. And thanks to the medical school for all the behind the scenes work when it comes time to get us promoted, and the committee service that is done behind the scenes. It's a huge amount of work. And I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us, and reach out for anything at any time. We look forward to seeing you on the next BEI activity.